All right, dudes. So here we are. We're about to round up our epistemology section. Now, hopefully, your brain at this point is absolutely fried and you are stumbling around the house trying to figure out what on earth is going on, right? Now, obviously, I jest. Now, well, to an extent. But where we left off was, a lot of this skepticism, right? And we looked at how some of the people are going to try to, some of the philosophers, some of the thinkers here are going to try to counter some of this skepticism. So we're going to pick back that up with that today. We're going to jump right back into that in our classroom. And so with no further ado, right? No further ado, let's pick that up right here.
Where did we leave off in epistemology? Does anybody remember? What is flipping epistemology to begin with? What is it? Well, how we know, right?
Yeah.
Like how we know, or even more radically in the modern sense of can we know, really? Like how this is this. Right, because I was trying to argue that both of those systems really just tailspin into skepticism, right? Now, so what we're going to begin with is we're going to talk about, we're going to start right with skepticism, because what is radical skepticism? I don't like how your book calls moderate skepticism. I don't like that. I just call that critical thinking, right? What is your book called modern skepticism? Modern. What is your book called modest skepticism? What does it call it? It calls it modest, right? What do they mean by modest skepticism?
Essentially, you don't believe anything until you have some sort of evidence.
Right, or at least like good reason, right? Some sort of good reason to believe something. I don't like calling that modest skepticism. I like just to call that critical thinking, right? But your book calls it modest skepticism. But radical skepticism is what?
You can never know anything.
Right, that we can't know anything, right? It's the guy that walks around, again, maybe he's had a philosophy class, or maybe he's just like literally like a philosophy class. And so he thinks that he's like, yeah, I've had this philosophy class, or maybe he's like somewhat like to dub himself as an intellectual. And so it's like, we can't know anything, we don't know anything. There's too many variables in reality that we can't know, all this kind of stuff, right? Now, so what we're going to start with is how do you refute radical skepticism? Because it's easy to walk in here, as we've talked about before, it's easy to walk in here and just question everything, right? That's the easy part. Like, who can't do that? So why does the guy that walks around questioning everything, why is he the guy that sounds like he's the intellectual? Or that he's the thinker? Why is that the guy? Right. I mean, it's easy to make you look stupid, right? Right. Right. I mean, it's easy to make you look stupid by just questioning everything, right? So, like, there's an author back in the day named Chesterton. He walks up and he's talking about an epistemological type of issue. And then he says, all right, this is like the guy who walks up to you and say you're outside or whatever, you're enjoying the day. And the guy walks up to you and he's like, why is civilization better than complete savagery? Well, that's just something that you take as so for granted that what? What do you have a hard time doing? Right. Like Chesterton says, like, well, I mean, you just look over at the stop sign and you look at like the street light and you see a policeman on the corner and you look at a car. Like, it's just one of those things you've so taken for granted that you're not even ready to try to respond to that, right? I mean, you're just kind of like, oh, well, I mean, look, well, the guy comes across as looking like what? He comes across as like the intellectual and because you can't even prove that. He's like, see, you don't even know why, walks off. But the problem is anybody can do that. Anybody can do that. Why does that count? Right? So again, like what we want to go back to is Aristotle. He's like, all right, if you want to play these games, we'll do it. But what? He wants to give you what? He wants to give you the what? He wants to give you the intellectual what? Weaponry, so to speak, to engage those kind of folks, right? Because remember, he was frustrated. Remember, he's in a search for truth. Aristotle, Plato, Socrates are these guys really looking for truth, really wanting to know the truth about things. And it's easy for the skeptics and all these guys to come up and question everything, right? Now, again, is there anything wrong with questioning and thinking through things? No, right? What your book calls moderate or something like that, moderate skepticism, what we would just call, or what I call just critical thinking. It's good to be that, right? But it's kind of silly to be just a radical skeptic. And we're going to see why. Now, we left off with Augustine because we were talking about how he had, well, first, obviously, way before Aristotle had come against that. But we're going to look at some of Augustine's responses to radical skepticism. Now, you can see how we left off with Descartes, right? The whole everything's a dream, like, how can you know if we know anything about reality, blah, blah, all this kind of stuff. Well, Augustine, almost in a way, starts making fun of these guys. Because he says, like, look, you think you know all this, and you can look at all this stuff, it's good on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Those are probably the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and the IEP, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, are really good sources on the internet for any of our stuff. Like, I would recommend you look at those. But anyway, this is in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And Augustine, in a way, like, he's going to intellectually engage some of this stuff, but in a way, he's going to almost make fun of them. Because he's going to say, like, oh, you get to be but then he starts just pounding them intellectually, right? And you're going to see what he starts to use to refute some of the skepticism. So let's go right after radical skepticism before we start talking about what we left off last time about what? We left off with what? How can we know reality? How can we know anything? How do we know that you're not dreaming? How do you know that, we can, our senses, if they fool us all the time, all that kind of stuff, right? Like, how can we answer any of that kind of stuff? But first, let's go after this radical skepticism, as if that's not radical already. But here, I'm going to pull this whole thing over there. How unintimidating would it be if I was like so mad right now? All right, so let's look at this radical, huh?
That would be funny if, like, Kathy, like, bitter, as they walk by, she's like, what?
Yeah. And then figure out. But so anyway, let's look at this radical skepticism. Again, as if some of the other stuff that Descartes said, what doesn't turn into radical skepticism? So what do you think would probably be one of the statements about radical skepticism? And again, I've actually heard this. I was in a coffee shop one time, a guy said this. I was like, what do you think it might be? What am I drawing over here? Obviously, I'm not an artiste. It's a purse, man. Even though it looks exactly like a purse. Go ahead and make it a little dirty or something. It's your little tool bag, right?
Oh,
All right, what's in this tool bag?
Let's stop there.
That's right. What kind of tools?
Intellectual tools.
Right. Your first principles, right? This is your intellectual tool bag, which includes your first principles, right? What's this one? Law of excluded middle, right? Law of non-contradiction, law of identity, right? This is what you're always carrying around, your little thing. Now we're about to see Augustine take these out and not just use them, but start just beating the absolute fool out of skepticism with these right here, right? This is why, remember when I said the first week of class is so important, because we're constantly going to go back to this, right? So the first thing that the radical skeptic would say after they go through all their arguments, after all their silly stuff, whatever, they would say something like, what do you think it's going to boil down to? We can't know any truths about reality, right? Because if your senses are fooling you, if we can't even show that we're not dreaming, if we can't even show that we can't even prove that you're not in the matrix right now, because anything you say, could just be in the matrix, right? Anything that you try to prove, an experiment or whatever, is just one of those things within the matrix, right? So what is their statement going to boil down to? The radical skeptic. Yeah, we need to run it. Piper, I am the one. So look, we can't know what. We can't what? I don't even know what this is, by the way. Can't know anything what? We just can't know anything about reality, right? We can't know the truth about reality. Now what's wrong with that? That's going to be the radical
Well, it
skeptic.
contradicts itself. It's saying like, you know something about knowing about reality.
That's right. That's completely self-defeating, is it not? Is that the truth about reality? Because if that's the truth about reality, then now we can know something about reality. However, if that's not the truth about reality, then we can't even know that what you're saying is true. Right? Look, right here, what is that? Law of non-contradiction. See how the radical skeptical position, ultimately speaking, the skeptics can say, we just can't know anything about reality. This is what the guy says as he's puffing on his doobie, right? Can't know anything about reality. Well, how do you know that? How do you know that then, right? If we can't know anything about reality, then how can you possibly know the truth about reality that we can't know anything about reality? That's completely self-defeating. So what does that do? Does that mean now we know everything about reality? No. But at least it opens the door, what?
We know something.
Right, it opens the door at at minimum. That's the symbol for minimum down here at the bottom of the chart. At the bare minimum, it what? Opens the door to what? To truth about reality, right? Now, so the radical skeptic already is falling over the law of non-contradiction. Now, as Augustine's going to say, he's going to say like, all right, look, I can show you all kinds of stuff. Because what if they say, all right, well, the door is open, possibly to some truth about reality. And then you can read all these on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, SEP, on the internet. So Augustine says, I can show you all kinds of crap we can know. They're like, what? Like what? He says, well, in fact, you can see Augustine argue hundreds of years, centuries before Descartes, a similar type of argument that Descartes offers, at least in regard to your own existence. But before he even gets to that, he gets to the law of excluded middle. He says what? Well, I know there's either one universe or what? Or multiple or infinite universes. Why? How is that true no matter what? I know that there's either, law of excluded middle, there's either, because this is a disjunct, right? Remember our disjuncted syllogisms? There's either one universe, what he calls world. He just says, and by world, he just means whatever there is, the heavens and the earth and whatever the universe entails. There's either one of those, there's either one universe, or there's an infinite amount of them, right?
I misspoke right here. What I'm supposed to say, or what I meant to say, and I'll clarify in a minute, but I meant to say there's either one universe or there's more than one universe. But I'll clarify that in a second, as you'll hear.
Now, could he possibly be wrong? No. Why? That's just a disjunct. There's either one universe or there's an infinite amount of them. Because what's your other option here? What's your other option? Right, we just would fit here, right? Right. Well, yeah, I see what you're saying, Lacey. Yeah, I mean, this entails, for simplicity's sake, this entails two also. 1, 2, or 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever. Right? Yeah, I see what you're saying. But that's not like, he's not saying like it's either one or just an infinite amount in that sense. He's saying there's either one or there's two or there's 3 or 4, whatever. Right? So can he possibly be wrong in that? No. Then he says what? Just have a little fun. Either there's one or there's an infinite amount of them, and I can know that I know what? That there's either one or there's an, and I can know that I can know. So he can know an infinite amount of things just based off this one thing right here, right? Now, and then he goes back up and apply that skepticism again and says, all right, so what you're saying is we can't know the truth. Right, we can't know the truth, which is what? Completely what? Self-defeating, right? Because if you can't know the truth, you can't know that. But then Augustine say, We can't know the truth, the guy or the skeptic says, we can't know the truth. He says, well, do you know that you don't know the truth? And do you know that you know that you don't know the truth? And do you know that you know that you know that you don't know the truth? Just on and on, ad in what? Ad infinitum, right? Ad infinitum. So you can know all that, just what? On and on and on and on and on and on. So he keeps going with that. Then he just goes through multiple examples using the law of excluding middle, law of non-contradiction, just showing all of these things that the skeptic can't deny, right? Just by using what? What were these? First principles. Just by using first principles of thought, he goes to show that you can know all kinds of stuff, right? All kinds of stuff. Now, does anybody want to say anything on that before we start to go into what we talked about or where we left off last week about reality? Anybody want to say anything before we go into that? Say. Does anybody else say that? I get in trouble for saying that. Say. I thought it was one of those things that everybody says, but not only is it, I guess, just a Southernism, but it's like an older, like, Southernism. Right? Yeah, all right. All right, so I don't want to jump into that. I want to talk about that for a minute. Like, what do you think about Augustine's arguments in regards to radical skepticism? I'm looking at some of this book stuff. What do you think about that? What do you think about it? Do you think you'd be able to use that in regards to anyone, let's say that they come out of their whatever class and they start saying all this kind of stuff? Do you think you'd be able to use that kind of stuff? Yeah, you did in a way, and I even almost copied some of that stuff to put down because I wanted to make sure that you were on the right track in some of these other areas because I felt like you kind of started to go this way. But I mean, you had a really good paper. All right, I need a volunteer. Who wants to volunteer? Volunteer, need a volunteer. All right, Andrew, you're a real man. Come on. Yeah. All right, get that little desk right there and just face me with it right there. Who's in this timeout chair right here? Look at that. I mean, that's really what that is. That looks like a timeout chair. I'm going to say that's a timeout chair. All right, so Andrew, I'm going to be Mr. Skeptic guy, right? And you're going to be, all you have is your little philosophical tool bag of first principles. Okay. So what are the first principles?
Law of excluding middle,
law of
non-contradiction, law of identity.
Right, and so what's the big one? I wish I wouldn't have said the middle one's law of non-contradiction.
Like law of non-contradiction.
Right, that's the big one, right? Because if anything goes against that, then so much for what? That. Right. So I'm going to be skeptic guy, and you're going to be like the intelligent guy. Well, I shouldn't create a false dichotomy because skeptic guy is probably what? And he's probably intelligent too, right? But he just doesn't have the tools, right? That Andrew over here has, right? But Andrew's going to give them to it. Is that right? All right, where are you from, Andrew?
Here.
Are you really? Where'd you go to high school?
Alexander.
Alexander. That has anything to do with what we're talking about now. Andrew's just kind of a cool looking guy, man.
There's something wrong with Alexander.
I mean, it's kind of a sissy school, but you know, we'll let that slide. I'm just kidding.
Bobby. I don't know names. I don't want to get
You know, Bobby. All right, so
Bobby.
basically, that's a perfect example of a red herring, completely off topic, irrelevant, right? Hey, do you know Bobby? What shirt do you have on?
I think I do know
No,
Bobby.
Oh, okay.
So today's your first day, so I have to start learning.
Well, that's nice. All right, so let's say that Andrew and I are having our discussion, right? And I'll be the guy, you know, we're sitting around at night or whatever, we're looking at the stars, and I'm the guy that, yeah, I know. I'm wearing a bikini.
Do we have a bottle?
Huh?
Do we have a bottle of wine?
Yeah. I'm wearing a bikini. Andrew's got a bottle of wine. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not kidding. No, really, I'm kidding. All right, so let's say we're sitting here and we're staring off into the fire, and it's just one of those like nights we're having these deep thoughts, whatever. And I tell Andrew, I'm like, Andrew, man, like, all right, guys, everybody, let's come on, hang with us. So let's say we've been watching Discovery Channel, right? And the girls has been on there talking about all this cosmological, this, that, and the other. And so I'm like, man, Andrew, Andy B, we just can't really know a lot about reality. In fact, everything's changing all the time. What we think we know, we really don't know. And so we just don't, you can't even, it's impossible to know anything about reality, Andrew. We just can't do it. Well, what might you say? We're talking.
So am I just gonna be like, hey, what you said breaks the law of non-contradiction.
That's right. Except, but put that,
You don't know anything.
but put it, hang on, but put it in your own words. How would you say that?
Okay, so you're saying that we really can't know anything.
Right, like we can't know anything about reality.
So if we can't know anything, how do you know that we don't know anything?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, yeah, that's right. We can't know anything.
Yeah. What do you mean? How is that right?
All right, so what Andrew might want to do there is obviously, because remember, people aren't used to what? They're not used to thinking like this, right? Because you can always just toss out whatever. So what Andrew's probably gonna have to do is point out that what the guy's saying is what?
It's contradicting itself.
It's incoherent. Incoherent, and not in the pejorative sense, but philosophically, that's an incoherent statement, right?
Right.
So when I say that, like, yeah, that's right, yeah, you can't even know what I'm saying is true. And so what Andrew's gonna have to do is point out what?
So you believe what you said is true, but yet you're saying we can't believe anything's true. You're saying we can't know anything, but you know what you said. But how do you know what you said if you don't know anything? Doesn't make any sense.
Right, so what that guy's gonna try to do is make it sound like, yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. But then Andrew, so he's gonna have to take the other side of that dilemma and say, but if that's exactly right, then you can't possibly be what? Right. That's why when something's self-defeating, you usually have to show it from both angles. What do I mean by that? When I say you have to show it from both angles. Why? I mean, because if something's false, it can be false 1,000 different ways, right? But if it violates the law of non-contradiction, one way, which has one implication, but then it's also going to be false another way that has what? The other implication, right? So if I say there is no truth, or we can't know anything about reality, all right, if we can't know anything about reality, then you've made a statement about reality, which means that you can't possibly know that because that would be a statement about reality. However, on the other hand, if that's true, then what? Then it's completely false, right?
And what you're saying is completely false.
Right. Because, why? Because you now have assumed to know something about reality, right? But that's exactly what you just said can't be known. All right, everybody give Andrew a hand. We'll let him off you did good, Andrew. Do you need to come to the timeout chair here? All right, so what are we talking about right now when we're talking about what all this little stuff, whatever that was, what was all that about? Radical what? Right. I mean, really, right? I mean, the guy that walked in one day, he says, when I was talking about the coffee shop, he comes in and he says, all I know is that we cannot know. And I was like, I realize you think you said something profound, but you just contradicted yourself, radically contradicted yourself. How? Because that doesn't even make sense, right? If you know that you cannot know, then you can't know that you cannot know because now you know that you cannot know. But if you know that you cannot know, then you cannot know, right? I did kind of yell at, but it's one of those things. Again, it's like Blaise Pascal said, what? People almost always arrive at their conclusions based on what? what they like, not necessarily on what's true, right? Now you could make that self-defeating, couldn't you? How? If you said people always arrive, right? We have to be careful of that, right? Oh, by the way, just a sidetrack, Piper, I remember one of the things you said. You said we couldn't prove a negative, a universal negative. But we can, it's easy to do. Now give me one, it's easy. It really is.
I don't know. Give me something.
No, you're the student, I want you to think. In Piper's paper, he said that we can't prove a universal negative.
I didn't say.
Well, that was the implication, that you can't prove what? Right. So the philosophical way to say that's a universal negative, because it just means categorical, right? You can't prove a categorical negative. So the first problem with that is what?
It wasn't necessarily implication of that, it was more in the scientific sense.
But that's a philosophical statement. It's not a scientific statement.
I meant,
So in what, okay, so what do you mean in the scientific sense?
that just because, what's the statement? It's, because it's not evidence of absence, that kind of thing.
So do you agree with the statement that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence? Do you agree or disagree?
Yeah.
Do you agree or disagree? Can't say yeah.
I don't agree.
You agree with that statement? All right, so what if I were to say something like, right now there's an invisible man in this room?
It may or may not be true. If you can't touch him, you can't feel him, you can't sense him. It is a possibility. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a thought that needs to go to great lengths to humor, but it doesn't change the fact that that's a possibility.
But I would say that absence of evidence for the guy in the room is what? Evidence of there even being one in the room, right?
That's the thing, is that a claim itself does not prove itself.
The problem with that statement, evidence of absence, or absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, is it's kind of subjective, because at times the absence of any evidence at all really is, it lends itself to evidence of absence. Right. So for instance, if I said there's a man in here and he came in here and he wiped out the entire room, and then I come in here and the room's not wiped out, right? Well, there's no evidence that he's done that. There's an absence of it. So that really is kind of an evidence for what? It not have happened, right? So you kind of have to take that on a as is basis. You know, you kind of have to evaluate that independently, I'd say. But anyway, that's neither here nor there for right now. Let's get back to epistemology, even though that is, right? Because we're talking about what is or isn't, what may or may not be. Epistemology stuff, strictly speaking. Where were we? Somebody help me. I've forgotten all that. Where were we at?
So, dismantling against radical.
Or Augustine, right? At least some of Augustine's examples, right? Oh, but a universal negative. Can we prove a universal negative? Empiricism, and we're going to get to that. Empiricism is that, right, all truth is the only way to know anything that's possibly true at all is through your five senses, right? Well, empiricism, it's going to get into that later. You don't have to worry about that for right now. But empiricism, hard empiricism, is just that if you can't taste it, touch it, feel it, what? Smell it, then right.
So
Rationalism is that you get to truth primarily only really through the mind, because your senses can what?
So now how does that relate
See.
to what you were saying about you were saying that it could possibly be true to you, basically, just also empiricism, you can touch it, see it, you were using what, was it rationalism, I guess, because that's your mind?
No, we were just saying that his point, saying that
No, I got that about the.
if you can't see it, or if there's no reason to think it's there, then why think it's there to begin with, right? So
It's a thought that can be humored, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's one you have to believe.
we may touch on that in a little bit, right? So anyway, let's get back to our skepticism or epistemology in that regard. What is the problem you see? How might you answer, and think about some of your reflection papers, because some of you said this in your reflection papers. How might you answer that we can't know anything about, whether or not we're dreaming, whether or not, our senses deceive us? How might you answer that kind of stuff? Some of you said some stuff in your reflection papers about it. Anyone? Madison, you haven't said anything all day. All day. I don't know. What about anybody else? Look how red her face is now. What? That's terrible? There are people out there right now robbing banks and shooting kids, and that's terrible.
We expect that from people. We expect that.
I don't expect that from those idiots. That's why I pop them in the face if I saw. Oh, I need to tell you guys a crazy situation.
Bank robbery, the kind of punch in the face.
I don't have time to get into that. I was a house fire in my neighborhood this week, and it was crazy, but I'll have to tell you that after class or something. Mm-hmm.
That I saw the fire coming out.
Well, this is in Carrollton. This is in Carrollton, though. This is Thursday or something. Anyway, I'm going to get lost in that. So you're back to your reflection papers. The person says, how can we look? How do you know you're not dreaming right now? We can't know any of this kind of stuff. You can't know that you're not in the matrix. Your senses can deceive you. What do you say to that?
Hey guys, it's important to know right now that we're making a pretty big switch right here. So I don't necessarily point that out as much in the lecture, but I'm making a big switch right now because we're going from the rationalist stuff, right? How you can't know reality. Now we're going back to the dreams that your senses can deceive you. Now we're going over into the objections that your senses can actually give you knowledge. So make sure that you note that and make sure you listen to the responses here, how we would answer those types of objections, because we're making a switch here we're making a switch at this point during the lecture.
It's stupid in one sense, but in another sense, it's not stupid, right? Stupid in one sense, right? How is it in one sense? How is it stupid in one sense?
Because what it is, if you can't do anything about it, then it just is your reality, and it's your reality.
I would say it's stupid in the sense of like, why on earth should I not think there's a desk right here? Why should I think that? But it's not stupid in the sense that it's like Descartes is not stupid, right? He's a genius. So it's not stupid in the sense that this is a real philosophical problem, right? So how might we answer this kind of stuff? I don't want to walk around every day thinking, you know what, I really might be in the Matrix. When I was 19, the Matrix came out. Isn't that the name of it? Yeah, the Matrix. When I saw that at the movies. Well, when we walked out of the little theater, I mean, these are the kind of types of people that you have at that time. Remember, at my life, when I was 19, remember at that time in my life, I didn't care anything about, or I thought I didn't care anything about what? Academics and philosophy and all that kind of stuff. But guess what? But guess who was the guy that was bothered when we walked out of the theater after watching The Matrix? Guess who was the one that was seriously bothered, went home thinking about it all night long? Me. Now I was seriously like, man, like, how do I know that I'm not in the Matrix? I mean, I know that's kind of absurd, but how can I answer this? Like, how can I really be sure that I'm not in something like that? And then so I was just wondering that and thinking about it. And so on the ride home, I asked my friend, I was like, hey man, I was like, isn't that kind of disturbing? Like, and he's like, what do you mean? I was like, the whole premise of that movie, like, think about it. Like, I mean, I know it's probably not real, but right now that could be the case, that what we're experiencing right now is not real. And what do you think he said? He's like, I'm starving. Let's go. He's not worried about it, right?
Like, calm down.
Right. So it's not, so it wasn't, it was almost indicative or kind of a, one of those foreshadowing moments. If it had been a movie, well, all right, this guy's going to be the one that probably gets interested in philosophy one day, right? Even though at the time, you don't think that you're interested in those types of questions. But if you're thinking that kind of stuff, you probably really are. Right, the soundtrack. What some song was playing, Josh, back there? Which one would it be in 1999? That could have been some Audio Slave. That could have been playing. And then it was a foreshadowing moment. So does anybody care? Does anybody really care? How do we know that what you're experiencing right now is real? That your mom really is your mom? That you're really in a philosophy classroom right now? Right, something like that. Like, does anybody really care? Because I care. If somebody could have told me at 19, I was like, how can we get out of the freaking Matrix? I would have wanted to hear it. Right. Get out of the freaking Matrix.
Is the guy in Matrix?
Yeah, remember that's the whole point, is that he finds out that he's in it.
Well, the premise behind it was that he is part of an actor group that kind of knows some of it. So it bugs him what the question is exactly what the thing is.
Right. So then he gets to the point where he can find, he can make the choice to either know the truth about reality or not. Right. That's the Peel thing. So right now we're at the moment of, right, to know the truth. So right now that's where we are. Like, look, do you want to know like the truth? Which a lot of philosophy professors or psychologists, all that would be like, and then try to roll you over into skepticism over here. And I'm trying to give you the truth. What I think is the truth, and I think there are better arguments that you can know it, that you really can know reality. One is what? One is that you can't even make the claim that you can't know reality. Why? Right, complete contradiction, right? Violates the law of non-contradiction. So what about those other things though? All right, so we've got that. We've got kind of a dagger in the heart of a radical skepticism. But how can we still answer somebody like Descartes knowing that we're not in dreams or we're not in Matrix and all this kind of stuff? First, let's look at this. Let's look at the whole option of your senses. Can your senses deceive you? Right, so we've already talked about that, right? That your senses can deceive you. And so Descartes argues from that what? That you can't trust them, right? What's the problem with that? Remember, when you dip the stick into the water, he's like, look, the stick looks completely bent. Like your senses are deceiving you. It's not really bent, right? What's the problem with this example? Think about this. All right, here's the bombshell that I want you to take with you and always remember this. When your senses deceive you, how do you know that your senses deceive you?
This is
When
big.
your senses deceived you in the past, how did you know that your senses deceived you?
This is big. Pay attention.
What served as the corrective to your mistake? Your senses did. So if you dip the stick into the water and it looks bent, and then you pull out and see it's not bent, how do you know it's not bent? What are you relying on? Your senses. So when you see the mirage you're sitting in the car at the red light and way up ahead in the heat of the day, you think a mirage or whatever, some water or whatever the case may be. And then you get closer, what served as the corrective to show you that was a mistake? Your senses. So do you see what Descartes' doing? Descartes has to assume what? At the same time, what? In order to say that you can't trust your senses, what does he have to assume? That you can trust your senses. Why? The only way that Descartes' argument can get off the ground is if you can do what? If you can do what? The only way his argument can get off the ground is for him to assume what? Why? Because you would never know that your quote-unquote senses had deceived you unless what? Your senses what? Also had shown you that you were tricked for the moment. So in order for his argument to even get off the ground, he has to assume that you can trust your senses. But what's the problem with that? You can't argue, your argument can't be that you can't trust your senses while having to assume that what? You can trust your senses. At best, that's a violation of the law, the principle of consistency. Why? Principle of consistency. Why? Because he's being radically inconsistent, right? Right. The principle of consistency is being violated, right? You can't assume at the same time that, oh, well, your senses can deceive you. Hey, you know that because my senses have shown me that I was deceived. That's radically inconsistent. So that's at best, it violates this. At worst, it violates what? The law of non-contradiction, which is an argument that could be said or not said at this point. But at worst, it violates the law of non-contradiction. At best, he's completely, radically what? Inconsistent, right? Because it's your senses that served as the corrective to your senses, which really means what? Right. You have to believe that you can trust your senses if you think your senses are deceiving you, because you wouldn't have known any other way that your senses were deceiving you. Does that make sense? Now, how about this? This is one of the funny ways, well, I think it's funny. You probably like, I don't care. But when I would talk to people like in a coffee shop or whatever, and they're trying to argue that they can't know anything about external reality, you can ask them just one question, aside from just showing them that that's completely self-defeating. What can you ask them? Who are you talking to? If you don't know that you're dreaming right now, then who are you talking to? Why? Right. They have to assume what? They have to assume that they're talking to somebody that's what? That's actually there, right? So for instance, one of them, the guy was saying all this, and I was just like, I'm not even here right now. What do you mean? I'm just some guy in your dream. But you see the problem? If for your argument to work, if you have to assume that there's somebody sitting there that you're talking to that's real, that's in reality, then you can't also sit here and argue that you can't what? Know anything about reality. Because you're having to assume that you know right now that you're talking to some real dude. Otherwise, I could just say, hey, wake up, you're talking in your sleep. Wake up, man, you're talking in your sleep. There's nobody here that you're talking to, right? Now, again, the dream argument. How do you know you're dreaming right now? How do you know you're not dreaming right now? Because you've been fooled in the past, right? You've thought that you were dreaming, blah, 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 or you thought it was real, and then you woke up and you were dreaming. How do you know you're not dreaming right now? Does anybody see a parallel? What's the parallel there? How do you know that you were fooled in your dream in the past? Because you can do what? In order for me to try to argue that, hey, have you ever been tricked by your dreams in the past and you thought, that it was real? What do I have to assume? What does that argument assume? Well, think about what we were talking earlier about your senses. Think about what we were saying earlier about your senses. If I have to say to you, hey, man, your dreams have tricked you in the past. You've been deceived by your dreams before, right? What do I have to assume as I'm arguing that? That you knew what dreaming, that you can distinguish what? Between dreaming and non-dreaming, between reality and dreaming. Problem there? I can't argue that you can't know that you're dreaming or not dreaming when my very example banks on you what? Knowing what? When you were and weren't dreaming. See how that violates again, at best, the principle of consistency, at worst, what? Possibly what? The law of non-contradiction. I can't try to appeal to you. I can't try to say that, hey, you can't know when you're sleeping and awake in the past. Well, how do you know they've been fooled by it in the past? Other than what? Knowing the difference between the two. Now, does that mean sometimes it's not hard? No, it's not what it means. It just means that obviously you can know the difference between the two. Otherwise, you can't argue. You can't make the argument. Right? Does that make sense? Is everybody following me? You can't make the argument. Now, let's say that they're not savvy to all of that and they just default back to, well, look, man, I'm just trying to say this. You can't know anything about reality for sure. What's wrong with that? Right. Do you know that for sure about reality? Right. You can't make, if you say that we can't know anything about reality for sure, that's a self-defeating statement because because you just made a statement about reality, a sure statement about reality that we can't know anything about it for sure. Right? But if you know that, then now you know a truth about reality. Does that make sense? So what am I doing? Am I arguing for reality right now? In a way, yes, but in a way, no. How? That's exactly right. I'm taking reality as a what? As a given, right? Why? Why am I taking reality as a given? I'm starting, remember, like the classical philosophers, classical realists start with metaphysics. What is metaphysics? Ontology? What is real? If you start with epistemology, what did we say last week's going to happen? I argue it's going to happen. It's going to go off the rails. Why? Because you can never get out of here. You can never get out of here, right? Unless you start here. Now, is that cheating if I start here? Is it cheating if I start with reality? Why? Why is it not cheating? What's your premise for knowing reality? Well, this. So if this is my starting point, you've got to give me an argument to show me that this premise is false. So all I have to do is what? Do I have to prove reality? No. All I have to do what? Is to show that your argument doesn't work. So if I can show that your argument doesn't work, at best, if I can show that it's even self-defeating, then what am I justified in doing? Just still not right. Why? Because this is just the strongest premise that we have. And remember, any argument that you make, you're going to assume what? That you have some kind of knowledge about what? Reality. If I can show, if you're going to try to argue against me and say that we can't know reality, I'm just going to point out that any argument that you make is going to have to assume the very thing that you say can't be known. One, you're going to have to assume that I'm sitting here, which is reality, right? Because if you convince me, what have you convinced into your argument if there's no reality? Who did you just convince into your argument? A non-real thing? Something that wasn't in reality, right? You're going to have to assume that you know reality anytime you open your mouth about not knowing anything about reality. So if I can show that your arguments don't work, then I'm justified in saying that I can know about what? Reality. Now, are we trying to say that we know everything about reality? Because that's what we'll say. Oh, so you think you got it all figured out? You think you know everything about reality? Is that what we're saying? Right, that you can know something, right? That's a much more modest claim. We're just saying, look, every argument you try to make defeats itself. That doesn't mean that I'm trying to say that we can know everything there is to know. But we can know some things. And then if we know some things, what can we do? What can we do? We can proceed from that, right? All right, if we know some things, then we're justified in what? Proceeding. Trying to find out if we can know some more things, right? Now, this is going to lead us to one of our, here we go right here. All right, show of hands, is science a good thing? Science a good thing, yes? Raise your hand. Science a bad thing? Raise your hand. Down with science. Now, what is the good thing about science? What's the good thing about it? Right, so you can make some progress, right? Right, so we can figure out some things about well, not necessarily about the nature of things around us, but we can figure out what? Right, we can figure out how things work, right? Which helps us to do what? Things like Lacey just said, discover this or that or the other, right? Science, by its very nature, remember when we talked about there's two types of arguments or two types of reasoning? What were they? The main two, deductive and what? Deductive and inductive, right? Now, what type of conclusions did deductive arguments give? Certain conclusions, right? If the premises are true, then what? The conclusion has to be true. If the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true, right? Whether you like it or not. Now, what kind of conclusions did inductive type reasoning give us? Probable conclusions, right? Some stronger than others, right? Now, what type of reasoning is science?
I would say
What does it rely on?
evidence.
Right, hopefully everything relies on that, right? But what kind of reasoning does the scientific method rely on?
Inductive
On
reasoning.
inductive, why?
Because sometimes the evidence say, you don't even.
Well, it's observation,
Yeah.
like you're observing, right? If this happens, then this will happen again, right? If this happens, then this will happen again. If this happens, then this will happen again. That's inductive reasoning. Now, again, probable conclusions versus what? Certain conclusions. Again, does that mean that there's no good reason to trust inductive reasoning? No. Now, David Hume's going to say that you can't. He's going to say there's what's called the problem of induction, that you can't even reliably have any sort of logical connection between cause and effect relationships. If we have time, we'll get into that. But for simplicity's sake, I'm going to say that Hume's wrong. If we have time, I'll argue as to why he's wrong. But science relies on inductive reasoning, right? Which is probable conclusions. Now, if science relies on inductive reasoning, he figured out, or has anyone noticed one of the most problematic claims about science in our modern day, in the West anyway? Do you might remember? So if we have hard empiricism, first let's go ahead and show you something about this. Hard empiricism is what? If you can't taste it, touch it, feel it, see it, then it can't possibly be true, right? Because that's the only way to know something that's true, right? David Hume says if there's not some sort of, this is what's called Hume's fork, and because I'll put it like this, like a pitchfork. David Hume says this is the way that you have to know something. Either your five senses or what? Some sort of logical truth. Logical, almost like a tautology. Like bachelors are unmarried males. So there's a logical connection between the two concepts, right? What are bachelors? Right, they're just unmarried males. So you see how there's two concepts, that has to be true. If a bachelor is an unmarried male, an unmarried male is a bachelor, that has to be true, right? Or some sort of mathematical truth, right? Right. So he says this is the only way to know, to get to the actual truth of something. If it's 100% logically connected, or it's immediately verifiable by the five senses, something like that. In fact, what's his famous statement? How does he say it? Does anybody want to Google it? Google it. Somebody Google it real quick. Type in Hume's fork. Read it. Quick. First one to do it gets a free 100 on their assignment. I'm just kidding. I'm just trying to get you to hurry up and do it.
All right, so obviously I have Hume's fork written for you down here on the slides. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit as these guys try to stumble around finding this thing for you, or finding the definition of it here.
So can you see the quote of it? Do you see where the quote of it is? Anybody see his little quote?
They're still.
It starts like this. It says, all right, did you get that? Does it contain what, Piper? On this side, what is it? Does it contain what?
Does it contain abstract reasoning concerning quantity?
Does it constrain abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? And then what's the other side?
Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter or fact existence?
Right. No. Then if it can't do this, then what should we do to it? Says Hume. committed the end to the flames because it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion, right? That's hard empiricism. What's the problem with that? What's the problem?
What I'm making reference to is what is the problem with this particular quotation? Remember, this is Hume's criteria, his axiom for knowledge. This, you want to know if something's true, you want to have knowledge, this quote right here, down here at the bottom on the slide, that's how you have to do it. What's the problem with that? It's a pretty big problem.
Huge problem. What's the problem?
Is that it's essentially saying that you can't trust your senses.
Well, this is his method for determining the truth, right? You want to know the truth? This and this. What's the problem?
These two things.
Hume's criteria does it what?
That's what I said.
We have to throw his entire criteria what? To the flames. Why? Is it this? It's not that. Can you verify Hume's criteria by your five senses? Nope.
Can't do that.
So you have to toss out David Hume's entire project because it don't even work. Self-defeated. Uh-oh. Right? Hard empiricism can't possibly be true because you can't even verify hard empiricism by its own criteria, right? It violates the law of non-contradiction. And it's not logically connected. There's no logical connection there in the sense of abstract reasoning or quantity or number. It's just not there. In fact, if you make it sound like that, it sounds arbitrary, like he just made that principle up, right? Now, here's the surprise of the day. I'm an empiricist. I'm just not a hard empiricist, meaning that I don't think that the only way to get truth is through your five senses or relation of ideas. Why? Well, because that's self-defeating. Now, here's what I was getting to about science. Now, hard empiricism has been blown out of the water for a while because it turned into what's called logical positivism, which was developed in the early mid-1900s. Logical positivism was just this. It was just that. That's all it was. Logical positivism turned into, and in philosophical circles it's dead, but in layman's areas, in almost all rampant on colleges and universities, except possibly in philosophy departments, is this belief here. This turned into this, which is just the same thing as that, which turned into this. And this is our last part of epistemology. What does that say? Can you even read that? Scientism, which was just, used to be called this, which used to be called this. So what's the problem? Scientology is hilariously goofy. All right, so what's the problem here? What do you think scientism claims?
See, hard empiricism, as I say in the lecture there, just turns into what's called logical positivism, as you see here, which turns into kind of what we call now scientism. It's just a progression of basically a name, but roughly the same kind of idea that Hume's fork was the way to determine what was or what is and what isn't true.
That science what?
Yeah.
That tells you what is and isn't what? Tells you what is and isn't true. You want to get to the truth, you gotta use science. BS. Complete. It's just straight up philosophically what? Bankrupt. I had a guy tell me one time, he said what? We were talking about philosophy stuff. The only way to know anything is true is with science. So how do you know that? How do you know that? How do you know that? That's not a scientific truth, is it? That's a philosophical assumption, right? Right, so I hope I can remember all five of these, probably won't. But for science to get off the ground, assume what? No, this is what scientism fails at. If you're going to say that scientism, remember, we're not arguing it's science. Science, good. Scientism, bad, right? Just so there's no fooling you, right? Science, good. Scientism, bad. Science first has to assume what? Science cannot prove what? The laws of logic, why? The first principles, why? Has to assume them, right? Has to assume them to get off the ground. So right off the bat, first principles. Science can't prove the first principles because it has to assume the first principles for science to even work, right? So when I say that science is what tells you the truth, what am I using right there? The law of non-contradiction, law of excluded middle, law of identity, right? I'm using every one of the first principles just in that statement. So science can't prove those. Has to assume them to even work, right? Science can't prove what? What else can it not prove? This is really bad. Why can't science prove mathematics? Because it uses them, right? It already assumes them.
It's the basis.
What? Can't you? Right. It's just mathematical truths are assumed by science, right? You can't prove them because it uses them. Right. Now what's another one? Science can't prove ethical truths. Why? I wouldn't say they're decided by us, but we'll get into that when we talk about ethics. Go ahead.
This is kind of interesting, but I did a paper in English class, this like focuses psychology of human brain, and like biologically and like in the animal kingdom, it's extremely common.
Right, yeah.
Most of us would argue that.
Forced copulation.
Yes, like half of all our recent conceptions are because of the hard science, but ethically, if you look at it, we're like, no, you know.
You can't do that. Well, science doesn't say you can or can't. Science just tells you what is.
It's just
It just says what is. It doesn't tell you the way things what. Here's the key word.
Alt.
Science gives you this, but it doesn't give you this. It gives you what is, but it can't give you what ought to be, right? In some sort of moral sense. Can't prove this. Why? It can't tell you aesthetic truths. What do I mean by aesthetic truths? Like what is or isn't beautiful, right? It can tell you why we think certain things are, right? Or it can point out what things we might think are. Oh, well, this particular face is these proportions and all that, but that doesn't tell you that that's beautiful. It just tells you the ramifications or the specifics as to what we usually think is beautiful, right? What's that? Well, yeah, they can, but let's say that they all happen to be the same. Let's say they did happen to just all be the same. Well, it could just show you the geometry or the proportions behind what? Those things. Or, for instance, a sunset. Like it can tell you what its composition is, why it looks the way it is, but it can't say whether it is beautiful or not beautiful, right? That goes into some sort of subjective aesthetic truth claim, right? And then lastly, science can't what? This is the funniest one. Science can't prove what? Science. Why? Just has to assume it to get off the bat. Let's go ahead and add another one. Science can't prove that reality is knowable. Why?
Because that's your personal reality.
It's an external reality to work with.
That's the last point there. Can't prove an external
Right, but
reality.
it can't prove that, can it?
Has to
Now,
assume.
philosophy can say reality is knowable, but I can also turn around and say, but I'm not going to say that I know that just from science. I know that from what? From philosophical principles, right?
Your philosophical curse.
Right, my philosophical man bag.
And
So I'm going to have to use that. Yeah, my satchel. Did you know that purse used to be a manfish? So I'm going to have to know this with philosophical principles, right? Does that make sense? All right, so unless we have anything else in regards to epistemology, make sure you don't miss the next few weeks, because this is when we're going to start our whole "does God exist" stuff, which is usually the most fun and sometimes the most heated aspect of the course. We're going to talk about, first we're going to talk about, before we talk about does God exist, before we talk about does God exist, we're going to talk about, is there even, like, is the question important? Like, why is it even worth talking about that question, right? And then after we talk, if depending on how we decide that, why the question's even valuable, why should we even talk about whether or not God exists? Then we're going to talk about arguments for God's existence, and we're going to talk about arguments against God's existence. And then probably after we talk through that stuff, will be when it'll probably be time for your first presentations and arguments, which means that you can make your presentation art.
All right, so I want to go ahead and conclude that. There's nothing really substantial after that point you're going to miss out with epistemology here. So epistemology, right? You see how this is a massive, though it's a sub-discipline within philosophy, it's a massive undertaking. There's a lot there. The key takeaways I want you guys to get so far is that it seems like we can't necessarily rely on just using your mind to determine the truth, because of all the difficulties that come along with that, right? Like, how do you can't get outside of your mind. How do you get to an external reality just by believing you can get to the mind or get to the truth through your mind? And then on the other hand, we can get to reality if we use our senses, but can we get to grasp all of the truths about reality if we just try to limit ourselves to the senses? So there was some big drawback there, right? Now, since this is an intro class, you'll have to do a little investigation yourself if you want to go deeper. But my view is that something like classical realism, moderate realism, is going to be able to bridge the gap between these two extremes, pure rationalism and pure or just hard empiricism. So you can look into that if you like. There's also, if you want to see just a humorous take on those last couple points I make, look up William Lane Craig on YouTube. William Lane Craig versus Peter Atkins, 5 things scientism can't prove is true, something like that. It's pretty easy to find if you want to see that. Again, don't let me forget, or tell me, guys, if you want the podcast. So if you want to listen to all of these same lectures while you're driving, riding a bike, working out, whatever, I can make this, I can send you the link to the podcast as well. You see what's coming up next. Some stuff about our philosophy of religion, kind of a little intro to some of those types of arguments. With that said, go back through, let's do it again. Hope you're enjoying the course so far. See you next time.